Karen's SUV plowed through my cornfield at dawn like a drunken rhinoceros, sending stalks flying and slamming straight into my Scarecrow, Henry, with a sickening crunch of wood and straw. The SUV barely slowed as Henry's head popped clean off and landed right on the hood like it was waving good morning. I stood on my porch, still clutching my coffee, mouth half open, watching as Karen reversed over what was left of him for good measure, and then drove off like she hadn't just committed premeditated Scarecrow murder in broad daylight. That was the moment I knew Karen wasn't just the usual kind of bad neighbor. No, Karen was a storm barreling straight for me, and the funny thing was, she thought this farm was hers to mess with. Henry had been standing guard on my farm long before Karen rolled into town with her pristine, cookie-cutter McMansion and her matching HOA attitude. The old Scarecrow might have been a little rough around the edges, missing a button eye, straw sticking out of his sleeves, but he had character. Every kid in town grew up knowing Henry, every bird knew better than to challenge him, and every fall festival featured him right out front with a fresh coat of paint and a silly grin. He was part of the farm, just like the creaky barn and the rust-red tractor that still coughed to life on cold mornings. Karen, however, saw Henry differently. To her, he was an eyesore, a word she'd used more than once during her brief but insufferable visits to my property line. She moved here 6 months ago, bought up the old Miller place across the way, and immediately tried to turn the town into her personal suburban development. Rules, regulations, and neatly trimmed hedges. That's what Karen loved. Wildflowers, rustic charm, and friendly scarecrows? Not so much. At first, I thought she might come around. Small town life has a way of softening even the stiffest of transplants. But Karen wasn't softening, she was hardening. Her first visit was just complaints about my fence being too rustic, meaning not whitewashed and plastic like hers. The second was about Henry scaring her dog, some yappy little thing that looked like a dust mop with legs. By the third visit, she wasn't asking anymore. She was demanding. I ignored her like any good farmer would. But Karen wasn't used to being ignored. That's when the trouble really started. The first time Henry got hit, I thought it was an accident. There were tire tracks, sure, but we all know how muddy these roads get when the rains come through. Maybe she skidded a little, misjudged the turn, and clipped him. I gave her the benefit of the doubt and rebuilt him. He wasn't perfect, but he was standing tall again by sunset. 2 days later, Henry was down again, this time with clear tire tracks leading straight from Karen's driveway. The imprint of her SUV's front bumper was still visible on his chest, like a signature. I might have laughed if it weren't so infuriating. Karen didn't even bother to deny it when I crossed paths with her at the feed store. She just smiled that tight, pinched smile of hers and said, "Maybe you should put him somewhere safer." Then she winked. She actually winked. Now, I'm not one to start a fight over a pile of sticks and old clothes, but I'm also not one to let someone stomp all over my land without consequence. Henry had been with this farm longer than I had. He'd been built by my father when I was still running around barefoot and chasing chickens. Every nick, every patch, every repair had a story. Henry was family in a way only folks who grow up on a farm could understand. And now, thanks to Karen, he'd been flattened twice in less than a week. That night, sitting on the porch watching the sun sink behind the hills, I knew this wasn't going to end with a simple neighborly chat. Karen had drawn the first line, and from the smug look on her face at the feed store, she was just getting started. The question wasn't whether she'd strike again, it was when. Sure enough, strike 3 came before the weekend. Saturday morning, while I was in town picking up some lumber and feed, Karen took the opportunity to finish Henry off for good. This time, I came home to nothing but a scattered pile of straw, broken wood, and a scrap of Henry's old flannel shirt fluttering in the breeze. But that wasn't the worst of it. There, pinned to the post where Henry used to stand, was a note scrawled in bold, looping letters. "Get a real decoration, Karen." I stood there staring at it for a long minute, letting the anger wash over me in waves. It wasn't just about Henry anymore. It was about respect. It was about the fact that Karen thought she could march into this town, into my life, and dictate how I ran my land. And maybe, just maybe, it was about proving that some of us knew how to fight without ever raising our voices. I gathered up what was left of Henry that evening and carried him into the barn. I dusted off the old workbench, still cluttered with tools and half-finished projects from when my father was alive. And as I stared at the pile of broken wood, I realized that Karen didn't just smash a scarecrow. She handed me the perfect reason to remind her that out here, on this land, we play by different rules. The funny thing about farmers is we know how to build things. We also know how to make sure they don't break again. And Karen? Well, Karen was about to learn that the hard way. Karen didn't stop. In fact, after that little stunt with the note, she seemed emboldened, like flattening Henry had turned into her personal hobby. It wasn't enough to just knock him over anymore. The next time I set him back up, patched together as best I could, she waited until a stormy night to finish the job. I woke up to lightning flashing across the fields and the distant thud of something heavy. By the time I got outside, Henry was face down again, soaked, shredded, and flattened deep into the mud, with fresh tire ruts gouged straight from Karen's direction. The audacity was unbelievable, but what really got me was the faint glow of her taillights vanishing into the rain as if she wanted me to see her handiwork. The next morning, Karen had the gall to wave at me from her porch, wrapped in a leopard print robe and sipping coffee like she hadn't just played demolition derby on my property. It was clear by now that she wasn't aiming for subtlety. It was about control, about seeing how much she could get away with before I snap. I've dealt with raccoons smarter than Karen, but even a raccoon knows when to quit before it gets trapped. Small towns have long memories, and word about Karen's antics was already making the rounds. Old man Jeff at the hardware store smirked when he handed me a bag of nails. "Heard you got yourself a scarecrow problem," he said. Sally at the diner, who'd been pouring me the same cup of coffee for years, leaned in and whispered, "You let us know if you need help building him back up." I appreciated the sentiment, but I knew this wasn't a job for community kindness. This was personal. It wasn't like Karen was even trying to hide it anymore. That week, she drove by the farm every evening like clockwork. The first night, she slowed down just enough to eyeball the field, grinning when she saw Henry's limp frame lying in the dirt. The second night, she rolled her window down and shouted, "Give it up, farmer boy!" before peeling out and sending a spray of gravel across the driveway. I watched her go, saying nothing, but in the back of my mind, something clicked. This wasn't about scarecrows. It was about pushing buttons. Well, she was about to find out I had plenty of buttons, and they weren't the kind you wanted to press. The fourth time she hit Henry, it almost seemed like she was disappointed I hadn't put up more of a fight. She didn't just flatten him. She parked on top of him like some kind of twisted trophy. There she was, sitting behind the wheel of that oversized SUV, scrolling on her phone as if using my field as a parking lot was perfectly normal. I stayed on the porch, arms crossed, staring until she finally backed off, leaving Henry a pulpy mess underneath the weight of her tires. I spent that night sitting on the barn steps, the wind carrying the smell of damp earth and fresh hay. I thought about my dad, who'd built Henry with his own hands back when I was just a kid. He used to say that every problem has a solution, you just have to be patient enough to find it. Well, I'd been patient. More patient than Karen deserved. But patience alone wasn't going to fix this. What I needed was a solution, a real one. Something Karen couldn't steamroll. That's when it hit me. Sitting there, staring at the old padlocked door on the far end of the barn, I remembered what lay behind it. Dad's old workshop. He hadn't touched it much in the later years, but back when I was younger, he'd taught me how to weld, how to shape metal, and how to make something last through storms, time, and stubborn neighbors. He wasn't one for fancy speeches, but he always said, "If you don't want it to break, don't build it like it will." The next morning, with the rooster barely crowing, I unlocked that door. The room smelled like old oil and memories. The welder was still there, tucked under a tarp. Steel pipes stacked along the wall, dusty but solid. Scrap metal, sheet iron, bolts. Everything I'd need to make sure Henry didn't just stand tall, but stood unbreakable. I ran my hand along the cold steel, and for the first time since Karen moved in, I grinned. By mid-morning, I was already sketching out the new Henry. He'd look the same on the outside. Same floppy hat, same stitched-up flannel shirt, same straw sticking out of his sleeves. But inside? He'd be pure steel. Reinforced pipes for a spine, welded crossbars for arms, even a steel base anchored 2 feet into the ground. No matter what Karen drove at him, she'd be hitting something that could take a hit and then some. And the best part? To anyone driving past, he'd just look like the same old Scarecrow. That afternoon, as I cut and welded under the soft hum of the radio, Karen drove by, probably expecting to see me sulking or patching together another Scarecrow with twine and hope. Instead, I barely glanced her way. Let her think I'd finally given up. Let her believe she'd won. Meanwhile, in the heart of the barn, sparks flew, steel sang, and Henry was coming back better than ever. The town buzzed with rumors. I wasn't exactly secretive about gathering supplies. You can't exactly hide lengths of steel pipe sticking out of your truck bed. Some folks whispered that I was planning a new fence. Others thought I was finally giving in to Karen's nagging and modernizing the place. Only a handful of folks, like Sheriff Tom and Sally, gave me knowing looks, the kind you give when you know someone's cooking up something special but you're too polite to ask. I worked late into the nights, stopping only when the frogs started singing from the creek and the stars were bright enough to light the field. Each weld felt like a quiet promise, not just to me but to my dad, to this land, and to every stubborn soul who ever had to deal with someone like Karen. Henry wasn't just going to be a scarecrow anymore. He was about to be a monument. By the time I finished, it was almost poetic. To anyone passing by, Henry looked the same, flannel shirt, worn-out jeans, crooked smile stitched onto a burlap sack. But hidden beneath the straw was a skeleton of steel. His feet were bolted deep into the earth. His arms were solid enough to stop a truck, and his grin? Well, that was for me. I propped him back up just before dawn, right where he'd always stood. The wind rustled the corn, the sun peeked over the hills, and there he was, Henry, standing tall once more. I sat on the porch with my coffee, watching the morning fog lift, knowing full well that Karen wouldn't be able to resist. She'd be back. The question wasn't if, it was when. And when she did, she'd be in for the surprise of her life. Karen showed up sooner than I expected. The sun hadn't fully burned off the morning fog when I heard the familiar grumble of her oversized SUV coming down the gravel road. I didn't move. I just sat there on the porch, coffee in hand, rocking gently like it was any other quiet morning. Karen's SUV rolled to a slow crawl at the edge of the field, right where she could get a good look at Henry. She stared at him for a second, squinting like she couldn't believe I'd dared to put him back up. Then, without hesitation, she slammed the gas and barreled straight into the field with all the grace of a wrecking ball. The sight of that shiny SUV tearing through the corn should have made me furious. But it didn't. Not this time. I just sipped my coffee and watched. She sped up, aiming dead on for Henry like he was her personal target practice. The bumper hit him square in the chest, just like it had before. Only this time, Henry didn't budge. The crunch echoed across the field like a thunderclap. Karen's SUV crumpled on impact, metal folding like wet cardboard, the front end buckling, headlights popping like eggs on a hot skillet. Karen's eyes went wide as the airbag punched her square in the face. For a moment, there was nothing but the hiss of steam and the confused flapping of crows, startled by the commotion. Henry stood tall, straw hat slightly askew but otherwise unfazed, while Karen sat stunned, dazed, and still gripping the steering wheel like the car might somehow drive itself out of this mess. I took my time strolling out to the field, boots crunching through the dirt, coffee still in hand. When I reached the twisted wreck, Karen was still fumbling with the airbag, pushing it away like it was personally responsible for her humiliation. She spotted me and immediately started sputtering. "What the hell did you do?" she shrieked, voice muffled by the deflated airbag and the steam rising from the ruined radiator. I tilted my head, taking a long sip of coffee. "Didn't do much. Just put Henry back where he belongs." Karen scrambled out of the SUV, nearly tripping over the mangled front fender. She marched up to me, finger wagging wildly like a metronome stuck on angry. "You booby-trapped it. I'll have you arrested. This is vandalism." "No, it's attempted murder." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. "Attempted murder?" I repeated. "Karen, you're the one who drove onto my property and tried to kill a scarecrow." Her face turned the kind of red that would make a beet jealous. She opened her mouth, shut it, then tried again. I'll call the sheriff," she finally managed. I nodded. "Please do." And call him she did. Within an hour, Sheriff Tom's cruiser was parked alongside the bent-up SUV, and Karen was pacing circles in the field like a caged animal. Sheriff Tom stepped out, giving me a subtle nod before walking over to Karen, who launched into a tirade the moment he got within earshot. She pointed, she gestured, she practically hopped up and down trying to convince him that I was some kind of backwoods maniac who'd turned a harmless scarecrow into a deadly weapon. Sheriff Tom listened patiently, hands resting on his belt, nodding in all the right places. When she finally paused for breath, he looked at me. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked. "Go ahead," I said, waving him toward Henry. Sheriff Tom inspected Henry like a county fair judge. He tugged on the sleeves, knocked on the chest, even crouched down to check the base. Then he straightened up, turned to Karen, and shrugged. "Looks like a well-built scarecrow to me," he said. "A little sturdy maybe, but nothing illegal about that." Karen's mouth fell open. "Sturdy? It's a death trap." Sheriff Tom raised a brow. "Karen, you drove your vehicle, without permission, onto private property and collided with an immovable object. That's not a crime on his part. That's poor driving on yours." Karen's shriek could have stripped paint. She turned on me like a wildcat. "I'll sue. I'll sue you for everything you've got." I just smiled. "Best of luck with that." Sheriff Tom escorted her off the property, but not before suggesting she get her SUV towed and reminding her that trespassing charges were still on the table. Karen didn't even respond. She just stomped back to the SUV, yanked open the door, and sat inside glaring at me through the shattered windshield like she wanted to set me on fire with her eyes. As the tow truck hauled her SUV out of the field later that day, half the town showed up pretending to be on errands just to watch. Old Man Jeff leaned against his truck, chewing on a toothpick, while Sally took pictures under the guise of documenting farm life for the fall newsletter. Sheriff Tom even stuck around, sipping sweet tea like it was the county fair. Karen tried to keep her head down, but the damage was done. Everyone saw. Everyone knew. And in a small town, knowing is half the punishment. The days that followed were quiet, but not the kind of quiet you enjoy. The air felt charged, like the pause before a storm. Karen didn't drive by the farm. She didn't make any more threats. She disappeared into that oversized house of hers, curtains drawn, shades pulled. But I could feel it. This wasn't over. Still, I went about my business, fixed up the fences, checked on the cattle, and every now and then I'd glance up and see Henry standing proud at the edge of the field, steel bones hidden beneath flannel and straw, watching over everything like he always had. Except now, he was more than just a scarecrow. He was a message. Karen might have thought this was just about some old scarecrow. She might have thought she could throw her weight around like she did back in whatever HOA-infested suburb she came from. But out here, respect is earned, not demanded. And Karen? She was about to learn the hardest lesson yet. The scarecrow wasn't the only thing I'd been quietly reinforcing. I'd been gathering something far more dangerous than steel. Proof. Karen came back swinging, just not in the way I expected. 2 mornings after the wreck, A crisp envelope showed up in my mailbox, sealed with the kind of dramatic wax stamp you'd expect from some fancy law firm. Inside was a letter thick with legal threats, accusations of endangerment, emotional distress, and the promise of a lawsuit so big it could bankrupt a man twice over. According to her, I had willfully weaponized a farm decoration with the intent to harm her and destroy her property. I sat there at the kitchen table, reading it over with my second cup of coffee, and by the time I hit the third paragraph, I couldn't help but laugh out loud. It was just so perfectly Karen. The paper probably smelled like her perfume, and I wouldn't have been surprised if she'd insisted the letterhead be embossed with gold. I folded it up, slid it back into the envelope, and set it next to the pile of unpaid feed store catalogs I hadn't bothered to throw out. I knew full well Karen didn't have a case. What she did have, however, was desperation. She'd been humiliated in front of half the town, wrecked her precious SUV, and now she was scrambling for a way to make it all my fault. But what Karen didn't know, what she hadn't even considered, was that I'd been ready for this from the moment I first found Henry crumpled in the mud weeks ago. Later that day, Sheriff Tom showed up, not in uniform, but in his regular jeans and old sheriff ball cap, carrying a brown paper bag with 2 sandwiches from Sally's diner. He sat down across from me on the porch and handed me one without saying a word. We ate in comfortable silence for a while before he finally broke it. "She's filing official charges," he said between bites. "Reckless endangerment, property damage, even tried to throw in attempted vehicular manslaughter." I chuckled. "Manslaughter? For a scarecrow?" Tom smirked. "Karen logic." He leaned back against the porch railing. "You got what I asked for?" I nodded and went inside. When I returned, I handed him a small thumb drive. On it was every bit of footage I'd quietly gathered over the past month. I hadn't just been patching up Henry, I'd been documenting everything. I had trail camera footage, security cam angles from the barn roof, and even a couple of old GoPros I'd strapped up in the trees after the second incident. Every single time Karen had rolled into my field to run over Henry, I had it in high definition. Her smug grins, her cackles, even the note she'd pinned to Henry's remains, all caught on camera. Sheriff Tom took the drive and turned it over in his hand. "You sure about this?" I looked out at the field, at Henry standing firm against the breeze, and nodded. "Time she learns you don't get to bulldoze your way through life out here." By the end of the week, the whole town was buzzing. Karen strutted into the diner like she owned the place, flashing paperwork at anyone who'd listen, bragging about the lawsuit, about how she'd have me and my farm tied up in court until I was begging her to buy the place for pennies. What she didn't realize was that Sheriff Tom had already handed the footage over to the county prosecutor. And just like that, things shifted. The following Saturday, right in the middle of town, Karen got served. Standing on the sidewalk in front of the hardware store, shopping bag in hand, when the papers were handed to her. Charges: trespassing, property destruction, harassment, and reckless endangerment. Turns out, repeatedly driving onto private property to destroy personal belongings, on camera no less, is frowned upon by the law. Karen's face drained of all color, and for once, she had nothing to say. No smug smile, no finger wagging, not even a flustered excuse. Just wide, disbelieving eyes. The news spread faster than a grass fire in August. By Sunday morning, Karen was the talk of every church potluck and gas station bench. Some folks pitied her, most didn't. The sheriff made it clear that there wouldn't be any special treatment just because she was from out of town. In fact, her HOA board, the very people she lorded over, voted to have her removed as president, citing embarrassment to the community and poor judgment. I heard they barely needed a vote. No one even argued. Her insurance company wasn't much kinder. After reviewing the footage, they declined to cover the SUV damage, stating clearly that the collision was the result of her own intentional and unlawful actions. Without coverage, and with court fees stacking up, Karen was drowning faster than a duck in a drought. About 2 weeks later, just when I thought the dust might finally settle, I caught sight of her packing up her SUV. A rental, much smaller and much humbler than the steel beast she used to terrorize my field. No contractors, no moving crew, just Karen shoving plastic bins and trash bags into the trunk like she couldn't get away fast enough. I didn't say anything. I just stood at the fence, watching as she slammed the trunk, wiped her face with the sleeve of her designer jacket, and sped off down the dirt road, kicking up dust behind her. A few neighbors gathered on their porches, quietly watching. No one cheered, but you could feel the satisfaction hanging in the air. Karen was gone, and peace had returned to our little corner of the world. As for Henry, well, he stood exactly where he always had, straw hat tipped just right, arms outstretched like he was welcoming the breeze. Only now, he sported a shiny little sheriff's badge gifted by Tom at the next town gathering. The badge wasn't official, of course, but it made everyone chuckle every time they passed the field. That evening, the sunset hit the fields just right, turning the sky into a wash of oranges and pink. I sat on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the cattle graze and listening to the soft rustle of the corn. The whole farm seemed to exhale, like it had been holding its breath right along with me. Karen came in like a storm, fast and destructive, but like most storms out here, she passed. I raised my coffee to Henry. "Good work, old friend," I said softly. Henry didn't reply, of course. He just stood there, steel bones hidden beneath straw and flannel, forever guarding the field. But somehow, standing under that sunset with the breeze tugging at his patched-up shirt, he didn't seem like just a scarecrow anymore. He felt like a reminder that sometimes the quiet, steady ones win the fight. You just have to stand your ground.